and welcome to What a Fruit Shop Taught Me About Being a Better Leader. I want to begin today by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I am speaking to you from today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I want to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples we have with us today as well, and I hope you'll take some time to do the same. So hello, I'm Meredith. Who am I? I'm a producer, marketer, business developer, and consultant kind of person. I've worked in VR, AR, and I was the producer for the Apple Award-winning Holovista with Actionable. I've managed teams both in person and remotely in my time in games. I co-founded Accessibility Unlocked, an initiative to support disabled developers in Australia and New Zealand. Up until July, I was full-time at Film Victoria, working to support the local independent sector with grant funding, pitching, designing programs, setting strategy, and so on. A lot of what I'm doing right now, however, is very firmly under NDA. So I'm very sorry, I'd love to tell you more, but right now I still have to keep my mouth shut. And I'm also still working very part-time to support Film Victoria as they transition over to a new team. All very exciting stuff. So that's me now. But a whole number of years that are not so long ago, I worked in a fruit shop. Just a normal fruit shop where we sold fruit to people who required fruit. It was by far the busiest fruit shop in all of Australia, servicing hundreds of customers a day and selling thousands of dollars worth of fruit. We fixed fruit with problems. We were the technological greengrocers of the world. For the purposes of this talk, all identifying details of fruits and people have been changed. Please do not sue me, fruit store. But you're most likely sitting at home wondering to yourself, how on earth does a fruit shop have anything to do with game development? So one of these things actually is like the other. I worked at one of the busiest fruit shops in Australia for about a year and a half. It involved multiple layers of interviews and 2 full weeks of training, which is more than most of game development training. Both industry spaces come with a wide variety of people from a huge variety of backgrounds, cultures, experiences, often young, creatively minded individuals. There was 300 staff at any one time, ranging from 18 to 65, that you were getting to know pretty intimately on a daily basis, which I would say is quite similar to Twitter. A large multitude of managers to report to, and what felt like very few avenues for progression in your career there. But in order to manage this kind of scale and diversity, process and structure was vital to encourage support and motivation amongst the team. With that many people, conflict was inevitable, and boy was there conflict and drama. That store specifically spawned about 10 relationships, multiple marriages, including my own. I worked with my high school best friend there after referring her to work there, and I also made some of the best friends I've ever had who attended my wedding this year 6 years later. It was also one of the most enjoyable, motivated, excited workplaces I have ever worked in. So much of that came from the kinds of people they hired and the kinds of structures they built. They had an incredible capacity to make you feel a part of something far bigger than yourself. And this is a feeling that I've seen captured in games by some of the best teams I've worked with. It's humanity bottled. Psychological safety, creativity, excitement, and joy. So, I'm a producer at heart, therefore I'm a sucker for an agenda. Today we're going to talk through 3 key areas, and you'll notice, at pace, we're going quickly. We got a lot to cover. We're going to talk about how the tools and experiences I had at the fruit shop informed the way I manage and engage with teams today. We're not going to cover everything, not even every most important thing, but some of the most common spaces to consider and resources you can engage with to upskill in these areas. So we're going to talk about feedback, leadership, and communication. This will include giving and receiving better feedback. We'll talk about the importance of team values and business values. We'll talk about transparency as a leader and how you can manage it. And we're also going to talk about making better hiring decisions. We're going to talk about practice, process, and outcomes, how to quickly assess your resources and determine what you have the power to change and what you don't. We'll talk about the dangers of overpromising and underdelivering. We'll talk about how to deal with uninterested team members ignoring process and how to get them on the same page. Finally, we'll talk about emotional management and empathy. If you don't listen to anything else, come back for this part. It'll be about better hearing concerns of your team or even your audience, the concept of psychological safety and how you can build it within your team, and ways in which you can upskill as a creative and support yourself. So let's start with feedback, leadership, and communication. The fruit shop I worked at placed a huge amount of value on communication. I would say that 99% of our job on a daily basis, regardless of our role in the store, was based on quick, efficient communication, from note-taking through to our one-on-one conversations. Game dev sucks at feedback, and that's a bad piece of feedback, and we're going to talk about why. One thing I never expected when I worked at the fruit shop was to be actively trained on how to give and accept better feedback. It's something that we all figure we're probably okay at. Feedback is opinions, right? And therefore it's something you should share actively and freely in order to create a better product. Feedback can be a super complicated thing. We often have no control over when we receive it, how or what it's about, how it's given to us. I bet every single one of you can think of right now a time where you had feedback given to you that was objectively terrible, unhelpful, and left you feeling awful for the rest of the day. The fruit shop spent a huge amount of time training us on giving feedback to one another, and it was actually called fearless feedback. The fruit shop prided itself on hiring people who, according to some old magical textbooks, could go toe-to-toe with the former founder, Mr. Jobs. They want staff who are willing to own their opinion, know how to communicate it in service of the product, the outcomes, and the customers. Rather than days spent on learning different fruit types or fruit repairs, the majority of our training was around that communication. We learned how to identify communication styles, barriers, and actions, as well as how to communicate with each other. In order to be able to give useful feedback, you have to be able to do this. And there are right and wrong reasons to give feedback. You should only be giving feedback out of commitment or concern for others, to support or enhance, to guide or mentor, or because it's your responsibility, ding ding leaders, to give feedback. Feedback is a critical part of game development, and we're okay at hearing it from our players. We are, however, completely terrible at giving it to one another. When it comes to feedback on a game or concept or mechanic, especially in our local industry, we tend to too nicify our feedback, setting our friends up to fail because we don't want to tell them that their game idea isn't actually all that exciting. Or we hit the other direction, offering opinions or saying it looks really good with no way to move forward. Both of these are poisonous to a productive game outcome. When you move beyond game feedback to team feedback and management styles, it falls apart entirely. There is a reason everyone I know has a private Twitter account, and it isn't to post about how hurt they feel at work. So how do we give better feedback as leaders as well as to our peers? There are 3 key components in order for your feedback to be useful. We were taught to give feedback at appropriate times, and that the reception of that feedback is on the person being present. We were taught to give actionable feedback, things you can change or improve on. You need to be able to articulate an impact, and it has to be specific. It needs to have potential outcomes for the person to move towards. We were finally accountable to one another. There was a sense of being able to give feedback freely up or down regardless of role. This doesn't mean you give it whenever and wherever, but that you're in a position of safety that you could reasonably do so if something was important to communicate. One thing many of us as managers take for granted is our team's mindset. We figure if they're at work, they're in a position to talk about it and receive that feedback, which isn't necessarily the case. You could be the best person to give feedback in the world and great at doing it, but if they're having something huge occurring in their lives, they are not going to have the capacity to process it at that time. This is where the fruit store taught me 2 specific tools to find the appropriate time for feedback. One was the phrase, "Is now a good time for some feedback?" Look, I get it. This can feel really scary to hear. It's sort of like when your boss says, "Hey, do you have 10 minutes for a chat?" on Messenger, and they give you no context. If you bring that phrase to someone and they say, "No, now isn't great," because they're rushed and busy and stressed, you accept it. That's what it's for. Obviously, if they say that every single time you ask to give them feedback, you might have a bigger problem on your hands in terms of safety. But it's about placing the power of feedback in the hands of the receiver. They get to prepare themselves, be open to it, and decide what they can and can't handle. You might even just ask if they want feedback. But I recognize, this doesn't necessarily sound like language a human would use. But just checking in and being like, "Hey, do you have some time to chat about that asset you checked in?" is a far more normal way that gets the job done. And we were taught to use that phrase really heavily for positive feedback as well as constructive. And we were given parameters in terms of having that conversation in privacy where it's just the 2 of you. We were all working towards the same goal, so that InterPeer feedback was frequent and constructive. And it was something that was actually fun. We used that structure to poke fun at the whole concept as a team. Like, "Is now a good time for some feedback? Just want to say your lunch looks tops. Really like what you've done with the bread." but it let us use it in actuality if we needed to. It gave us a clear structure for the whole team to safely communicate and set parameters to operate within. This greatly reduced the potential for team members to give inappropriate feedback at inappropriate times. They knew it needed to fit within the structure. So what about actionable feedback? In game dev, we often hear a lot of generalizations thrown around when giving feedback, good and bad. So it needs to be specific. And as a manager, a large part of your job will be synthesizing the feedback provided to you by other team members or about them. People might not be comfortable giving feedback directly to a coworker, so it's up to you to hear them, recognize if that feedback is actionable or personal, and generate a useful outcome. What does this mean? It means you as the feedback giver need to be able to provide specific examples of what you noticed. There's a huge difference between, nah, it doesn't look right, can you give it another pass, to my eye, the proportions on the character are a little bit off and the arms seem too big. I think that could be confusing. Can we try resizing those and taking another look? This sounds simple, but in the moment, many of us speak before we've processed what we're actually thinking, and we can't articulate the what of the feedback, let alone the why it needs changing. In the same vein, saying, you did a great job today, isn't feedback, it's encouragement. This is valuable, but it's not actionable. There's no next step, no progression. If the person can't walk away with a clear understanding of what you've recognized in the direction you want to go in, you're often just sharing an opinion. This gets more difficult when you're dealing with things that are related to them as a person rather than the work. We've all, at some stage, for example, maybe worked with someone that's a little bit smellier than we might like consistently. These are awkward conversations to have, but as a leader, they do have impact on the workplace, and it's up to you to have them. By considering the previous idea of being appropriate with your feedback, you can either set up specific times for feedback as a manager, like frequent one-on-ones, meaning people have time to prepare, and that way you confirm that they're in a position to receive it, and then you can give them that actionable feedback. So in terms of accountable feedback, the structures we were given meant that we were far more accountable to it. There was a sense of being able to give that feedback freely up or down, regardless of the role, and a psychological safety that the structure provided. This didn't mean it was perfect or easy every time, but it was far easier to operate within a clear structure. Additionally, those one-on-one catch-ups being locked in as one of the most important things that were done organisationally. With 300 staff in a really busy store, you'd think this would fall by the wayside, but I was always taking at my time for my one-on-one catch-up to talk about my experience, share my concerns, discuss my career path, and have a nice paid hot chockey in the process. There was a sense of me, the individual, as a priority for the business, which completely changed the way I valued the organisation itself. Because it prioritised me, I wanted to prioritise it in return. We were accountable to one another and therefore respected that accountability. There are a few things you want to try to avoid when giving feedback though. Don't give feedback to defend or excuse your own behaviour, if you're in a bad mood, to appease a third party, to demoralise or condemn. Take the time to know what your goal is with what you're communicating. We've already talked about not targeting the person, but targeting the behaviour or the work. So if we think about that kind of smelly person, you're smelly sucks to hear and doesn't give them anywhere to go with that. Compared to, hey, I'm not sure if you know, there's a bit of a strong odour to you today. I don't know if it's your clothes or something else, but I figured I'd let you know. If there's something bigger going on, I'm happy to chat about it, but it'd be great if you could get that sorted. This is awkward. It sucks. But these are the kind of conversations that you have to have as a leader, often on behalf of your team. And often the individual is actually pretty receptive to hear it. I can tell you that they will be, because I had to do that at the fruit shop. A person can change a behaviour, but they can't change who they are. So think about the behaviour that you want to change specifically. You also want to avoid identifying feedback as a colluding process, like everyone is saying, or Sarah said that you were mean to them yesterday. What happened? If Sarah's brought feedback to you, you are responsible for asking if she wants it addressed at all, and then restructuring or de-identifying that feedback if possible. You need to protect her as well as the person you're speaking to. So instead it might be, hey, I heard there was a rough conversation yesterday between you and Sarah. Can you tell me a bit about what happened? Are you okay? Otherwise, you set your team up to lack trust in one another as well as you. They'll form smaller cliques, they'll speak less freely, and they'll almost certainly no longer confide in you if you determine that you are the owner of sensitive personal information that they didn't want shared. You as the leader own all the feedback at the end of the day. Don't protect yourself from the awkwardness by hedging the blame. You have to take ownership of the feedback if you're the one giving it. In the same way that you have to take ownership of the duty of care if they bring something to you that you have to action, and you need to communicate that to them. We've talked a little bit about the too nicifying. Don't overly soften the blow. If you are too gentle, it will not come off as feedback at all. Be clear, precise, and kind, and make it clear that it isn't a big deal to you to be having the conversation. But the more you soften it, the bigger a deal it feels. It's not you, it's me, sucks a lot more and is a lot less helpful in a breakup than I don't think we're compatible because of the way we argue, and I don't think that's solvable. Radical candor can cause a shiver in a lot of people with its cult-like adherence, but the concept is relevant. You bend too far in one direction and you won't provide anything helpful. Ruinous empathy is just as damaging as obnoxious aggression. So to summarize, within a game dev studio, you can create accountable feedback in a few ways. Stay curious. Ask your team how they best receive it at onboarding. Do they prefer to receive it in text, so they have time to process it and think about it responding? Do they like it ad hoc and frequently? Are they someone who seeks out feedback in general or wants to grow in certain directions for their career? How can you support them to do that? Set a structure for feedback within your team. That might be as simple as the above, each person communicating to you how they best receive feedback and you setting up a structure for them, or it might be frequent one-on-one catch-ups with your team. You want to ensure that feedback comes often and is an unsurprising, fair part of the process according to how those people best receive it. Some people may just never get along, but in a one-on-one you can act as a facilitator for how they can better communicate feedback to each other about the work because you'll be aware of their preferred styles. It also takes the onus off them as individuals to solve the problem. They can come to you to discuss it because you've communicated its value and you can take it for them. Remember, the feedback itself needs to be appropriate, actionable, and accountable. You know who doesn't like feedback? Customers. Oh boy. One great thing that the fruit shop taught me was the customer's actually not always right. I had an appointment once with a couple who had broken the front of their orange and they were having issues with their pulp. Their pulp was draining really quickly. And we were happy to replace their pulp, but they would have to pay for the front of the orange because taking it off to fix the pulp would cause problems. I hope you're following me. I explained this a number of times as kindly as possible that there would be a fee for the part that they had broken, but we would fix the part that they hadn't at no cost. They got pretty frustrated, they got more and more angry, and at a certain point, they asked to see a manager. I went and got my manager, one of the few that was on the floor that day. He happened to be 6 foot tall, super built, very scary looking guy, but one of the gentlest humans you've ever met. And he came over and asked them what the problem was, and they told him what had happened. And he asked them, and what has Meredith told you? And they told him that, and he said, so why am I here? And genuinely is like I don't understand why you've called me over. They started ranting about how unfair it was, and he again explained that what I had said was correct. There was nothing he could escalate. He was going to tell them exactly the same thing. It got to the point that they told him that they were going to take him and me to a current affair. They asked for both of our details, to which he put down every detail of himself, including his personal email address, on his business card, and told them that he couldn't wait to be on TV, which is still one of the funniest moments of my entire life. But when we started at the fruit shop, they gave us a credo, and the number one value was not customers. It was that our most important resource was our people. The customer was important, don't get me wrong, but our people and our team values had to come first. For a dynamic, high-paced environment, which games is very similar to, this was so important. We had to be able to rely on one another first and foremost in order to be able to actually deliver to the customers, because we needed to be able to pull each other in and jump around where possible. So why is this so valuable though? As a manager, your main role is to back your team and back your people, and then back the process towards your outcomes. Not always, not in everything, but at key times when they need the support in order to feel heard, understood, supported. Whether you're a director or a producer, you're going to encounter periods of interpersonal conflict, external studio pressures from publishers, and more. I'm not saying you need to turn around and tell your publisher that you will take them to a current affair, but you have to be ready to communicate the vision and goals of your studio and hold both your team members, yourself, and partners to those standards. This means you own the outcomes of work. If someone on your team underperforms, you made a hiring decision to bring them in. It's up to you to solve it. You don't get to shift that blame to your staff member or slide in as the manager and suddenly save the day, because it's up to you to create the environment and staff that people can perform in and excel in. The Games Outcome Project, which was done in 2016, surveyed a whole host of different elements that impact a project. And beyond team size, engine, experience, one area indicated successful projects more than anything else. They asked teams a host of questions around 5 key enabling conditions for teams to function optimally, about leaders as facilitators and owners. The highest performing condition was around having a compelling direction. believing in the vision of the game or the studio. In the same vein, the vision of my role was communicated to me at the fruit shop from day one. It was to take an unhappy customer, hear them, understand them, and provide them an outcome that fit with our values and organisational vision, with as much care and kindness as possible. I knew my role, the resources I had available to me, the parameters of success, and what my options were if I felt like I was unable to do anything beyond those values. And my manager was there to step in and continue to uphold those values without compromising me or my work. It means not picking favourites or sides. My manager backed me in that moment, not just because I had followed process and procedure to the letter, as well as communicated as empathetically as I could. He backed me because I was reflecting the organisational values. And while the external party was displeased by the outcome of those, it was more important for us to stick to those values than to please that specific individual. It was about long-term benefits versus short-term gain. Had he gone against me in that moment, he would have shown a different value proposition of trusting his staff, which would have jarred directly with the values set to me at the start of our training. In the same way, the values you set for your project as well as your organisation provide you a framework to balance against and examine against. If you don't set these values, they will show themselves over time through action. If you don't set them clearly at the outset, your team will work against their own, which may be very different, and you're going to run into lack of agreement on business and project direction. If you set the values and go against them, you set the expectations of the team that they're unimportant, and your culture will be affected. Let's say you value transparency in your studio and you set expectations around reporting. Now, if someone isn't doing that reporting, you have a structure for the conversation to have with them. Similarly, if your project design hinges on value and collaboration between players, you now have a structure to reflect your decisions against to make sure you're keeping against those. Having clear values is one of the most important things you can do for your business. This is easier said than done when you aren't being held over a pit while the publisher or platform or whoever holds onto your money and livelihood. But what it does mean is identifying your values and aligning your team to those means solving disagreements is easier. This goes both from studio values, meaning you can hold people accountable to what you set, but also to project if you have design vision locked in. It also means if you are actually forced to compromise on those values, you have to do so actively and consciously, because you'll have to look your values in the face and decide if that's a bridge you cross. You can look at your publisher or platform or business opportunities and see whether their values actually align with yours, rather than stabbing in the dark, shifting your direction frequently, entirely for potentially short-term gain. I recommend spending at least a week on setting your company values if you don't already have them. Sit down, get a big whiteboard and write out everything that's important to you as an organisation. You can do this with just the leaders, then bring in the entire team, do it all together, or do it by yourself if you're a solo developer. Then circle your top 3 one by one. What matters to you and what are the consequences of those values? There's a really good GDC talk about how the Witcher devs turn great ideas into great features, and one of the things they do is consequence mapping, which is what you can see. Do the same thing for your values. If you value financial stability and creating original IP, what are the consequences and overlaps of those decisions? Which do you weigh more heavily? This will help you when inevitably difficult decisions present themselves, like you've got contracts coming in that will give you financial stability, but you cannot focus on your original IP. Similarly, if you value control of marketing of your games, do you want to hand your comms and sales over to a publisher, or do you need one that will let you manage these things entirely? That in and of itself will cut your publisher decision making in half pretty quickly. Do you want to self-publish entirely? Ask yourself the questions you may never have to tackle, know what your values are in relation to them, so that when they come up, you have a process to examine them against. For game values, I really recommend the talk by Ruth Tomendel on embracing ambiguity. She talks a lot about design pillars you can set, how they can be used to reduce team ambiguity and help you with direction. Your game values will often lean on your business values as well, so you need those business values in place. If you value making narrative experiences, suddenly making a combat-only game is going to clash with your pillars. It can help you identify errors in direction early, or at least recognize actively when you're pivoting as a decision in the kind of games you make, rather than a result of circumstances or just a cool idea. Pillars and values help you to reduce ambiguity, set direction, and encourage transparency overall. Which is a great segue! Everybody likes to talk about how transparency is a cornerstone of good teams. Transparency is a make or break material. I have sent team members home crying because the director has told them key financial information that was not relevant to them in a forced all-day staff workshop that was thrown into the middle of a week sprint that made them concerned for their job. Transparency can be a weapon, and it should be wielded as so. It should be wielded carefully with the knowledge that it can cause true damage. At the fruit shop, we had transparency on a couple of levels and multiple times each day. Because such a large amount of people would come onto work at specific times, we would have this download meeting where information was diluted in 3 ways. And this was a paid 15 minutes before the shift started. We would first view materials at an organisational level or discuss them. So this would include videos from leadership headquartered in the US, discussing key organisational changes, benefits, opportunities, and more. These were made to be relevant to everyone regardless of their role, and were very much about aligning against values, upcoming events, those sorts of things. This was always general, unspecific, positive information or actionable feedback that was kind of across the board. We would then speak at a store level, and this is where we would have more specific feedback or key information communicated. This was everything from operational circumstances, like if our ATM and payments weren't working, if we were behind on our fruit repairs, anything that we needed to know in order to do our job that day and on that shift. And then finally, we would split out into smaller teams depending on our role in the store and discuss key information surrounding our outcomes for the day or week. So problems that weren't relevant to other teams. We were never told managerial issues, executive problems, staffing problems, beyond, maybe we're a person down today because they're sick, but the manager was going to step in, or anything operational that wasn't relevant to us doing our individual jobs. By setting this tone at multiple levels, we were given all the context we needed in order to perform that day. And if we were to examine it with a game development lens, it might look a little more like this. You have executive teams deciding on the organisational level information that needs to be provided, which might be on a project basis specifically. If you're a small business, you probably don't need to collaborate with hundreds of fruit stores around the world, so the amount of times that you need to share that information is reduced. But everyone should be across value level specific information that's relevant to them. If the information might impact on the project, you might either bring it to a team-wide meeting or a production meeting to flag it, and then they can take it to the team. Finally, at an asset level, people need to know where things are at. So you should be doing your daily stand-ups, understanding exactly what's blocking someone. We'll tackle this more later, but let's talk about the kinds of information first. When thinking about transparency and what you share with a team member, you need to ask yourself, do they need this information in order to do their job? Is this the right time to provide them with this information? Is this a problem that they can help solve, or do they have no ability to impact this? If the answers to any of these are no, you might be engaging in too much transparency. We've all been in a position where we've had information that we've had no power over, we can't change anything, so we're now staring at problems or thinking about problems that are inaccessible and unsolvable to us. This is a massive contributor to stress. So what else can too much transparency cause? If you're too focused on understanding every decision's reasoning, like if you're demanding responsibility, shifting responsibility for executive level decisions onto team members that don't have access to that power to change them, you're going to be asking what a lot more than why. This is going to reduce people's ability to bring new issues in the organisation and reduce the ability of experimentation. People are going to worry that anything that they do is going to be brought to light in front of everyone and scrutinised rather than understood. This creates a blame culture, and people will hide information rather than share it freely to try and contribute to a better product. If you give too much information to your team and overload them, you'll set them up to fail. Not every staff member needs to know your cash flow for the next 6 months, and bringing them into an executive level meeting where they have no ability to impact it is going to create unnecessary fear. Similarly, if you're transparent about every thought occurring in your mind at a values level or business level, you're going to create a sense of instability. If they're being given new high-level, values-level information every week, they're going to feel that the project and team has no sense of direction. They'll withdraw, they'll feel unmotivated. So if we want to support transparent environments, what should we do? The Harvard Business Review talks about a few key supporters for a transparent environment that don't impede productivity. One is to create boundaries around zones of attention, so to avoid exposing every small thing to scrutiny. So this is helped by splitting the conversations out into those funnels. We've all sat at a desk wasting hours trying to appear busy because you're worried about the perception if you finish too quickly. I do my best work when I'm not being observed. Same with how I can't park if someone is watching me do it. You want to draw boundaries between feedback and evaluation, which we've already spoken about. Structures avoid efforts wasted on managing impressions. People know what kind of feedback they're going to get and when, and they're not going to be worrying about constantly being reviewed and then it brought up in front of everyone like we discussed. You want to set boundaries between decision rights and improvement rights. So give people time and energy to tinker and iterate freely in directions they see fit. And we'll talk about autonomy a little bit more later, but this is a key part of trusting your team to experiment. And finally, putting boundaries around defined periods of experimentation to avoid frequent or infrequent interruptions. This might be no meeting days, time-boxed explorations, time-boxed professional development of their choice. All those things can help to set boundaries for transparency. Also, with a huge amount of us moving to remote work, a lot of managers and directors are more afraid than ever of transparency and autonomy. They can't see exactly what teams are working on, which gives them this sense of fear, and the level of trust has shifted. This begs the question, why have you hired people you don't trust to complete their work? But we'll talk about that later. So how can we continue to encourage transparency within a team if we're remote entirely? You want to set expectations for transparency by your actions. You're responsible for being transparent about your work in the same way as your staff members. They should be aware of what you're working on, but not every detail. If you're working on closing a publishing deal, they might need to know you're dealing with business opportunities, email, payroll, anything that might be relevant so they understand your workload and your availability. When you report on this, you're providing that high-level, value-driven organisational reporting. You don't need to go into specifics with the entire team as it won't be relevant to half of them. One of the things that we've been doing as a remote team, not that I'm in a remote team or anything like that, is a weekly open and close. So this is one thing I found really valuable. It's about setting clear goals at the start of the week, flagging anything that might cause you distractions or that you need more time on, any major blockers, and allows for transparency of where your focus is and what outcomes you're prioritising. This lets you as a leader catch any things before the week really kicks off and you're deep in the work that might be misaligned with what the outcomes need to be. It also keeps you accountable because at the end of the week you need to flag where you got to and why. This is a redacted sample of a weekly open, but they've been really useful in seeing where people are at or if they're feeling a little lost earlier than daily stand-up, sorry. You aren't representing every single facet of work, but you're giving that high-level goals and needs, and you're removing that feeling of being watched for staff because they can speak autonomously. All you need to do is gently nudge directions with daily stand-ups and things like that, but you need to give your staff autonomy, and visibility breeds discussion. By making this an expectation of everyone at the start of the week, you get a lot of clarity at an executive level, and you can see when people drift away from the targets or the targets you've set. No one in your team needs to know every thought in your head. Consider what's relevant, what's helpful, build structures to support dissemination of information, and allow all team members space for their own transparency. You're building a team, not a game. As a creative, we often decide to start a studio because we have an idea for the best project ever. This is one of the worst places to start because the second you start a studio, you're a leader and a manager and not a creative in the same way you were. The game for you now is optimizing your studio and your people. So the best thing that you can do is to hire well according to the values you set and then prioritize those people. Understand their strengths, elevate them wherever possible, but not fixing and punishing their weaknesses. When we were going through the hiring process at the fruit stall, they were both group and in-person interviews. And what we didn't realize at the time of hiring is that while we thought we were just applying for a general retail role, they were assessing us on our strengths against their internal values for each team and therefore assigned a role accordingly. It boiled down to kind of 3 core teams that you can see here, and within those teams there were specific specialist areas that we were responsible for. I answered a whole bunch of questions and ended up being assigned fixed fruit. I was told that they felt that I had specific skills around empathy and communication, an understanding of technology and potential problems, and an ability to problem solve. They knew what they were looking for, and it was less about the role I would do and more about the strengths I had as an individual. The entirety of that specific team were all super different, and all very different backgrounds and approaches to actually fixing fruit, but all had similar values and a similar end goal and motivated by similar things. So let's talk a little bit about the hiring stage, because we're going to talk about motivations later. When you've set those earlier values, you know the values you want your staff to have. So how do you communicate value when you're building a team? Again, with the change to remote work, more and more local studios are competing for talent, and we're going to see a real struggle to build out the right kinds of teams. The right teams can build any kind of game that they really need to. What matters is building out a team that cares about your projects. One of the earliest ways you can communicate value is with your job ad, and there are a few ways that you can signal positively before you even start. Before you get into the role, explain your organisation. Don't assume they know who you are, especially as a smaller team. How many staff do you have? Do you make contract work or original IP only? Set the scene for an applicant so they can make a quick determination about your organisation prior to further research. You want this to include your location, whether you're remote or in office, any other key organisational information. And if you can give context on your current project or projects, you should. That's what they're going to get excited about. If you're hiring contractors, say so. Give people a window of expectations. Give them a window for remuneration if you can. Give flexibility for negotiation if that's relevant, if you are conscious that you're a bit worried that you're going to be under budgeting or over budgeting. Give detail of the benefits of the role. This could be anything from financial, emotional, development, whatever's relevant to the role itself and things you might be teaching them in first week onboarding. Explain the paths for them. Maybe this is a contract with a window to full-time. People are always looking ahead. Is it full-time from the outset? Do you have a professional development budget? How is someone going to eventually walk away, whether short-term or long, from your organisation better off? Communicate your organisational values. This is done in a few ways and can be done by signalling action far more than words. You can say that you value diverse teams, or you can explain the systems you have in place internally for supporting those candidates, or even just a picture on your website that isn't 20 of the same person that will clearly communicate that message. You can say you support young parents, or you can say you have paid parental leave. You can say you care about mental health, or you can say you have a monthly mental health RDO. Stop saying what you value and show what you value wherever you can. Create a realistic expectation of them as a creator. Stop asking for people to have 10 shipped titles. Is that what you really want? Them to have shipped a bunch of projects? Or are you more interested in them understanding release pipelines? Do you care if they have a degree, or are you more interested in them being up to date with new technology? Figure out what you need and set reasonable, fair expectations. Many individuals will not apply if they don't meet 100% of requirements for a job ad. So be clear about what is a requirement versus what is nice to have, and be ruthless about the differentiation. Run it through programs. There's a great tool called the Gender Decoder that will check your job advertisement for any overly coded language. I ran a job ad that I recently drafted through this program and got this result. And the research shows that men will not be affected by feminine coded advertisements, but that women and marginalised individuals are frequently stopped from applying if a job is too masculine coded. This is important if you want to hire more diversely. So you put out a great job ad, it aligns with your values, and now you're sitting across from a bunch of great candidates. Jesse Shell did a great GDC talk called Game Studio Leadership, You Can Do It, back in 2017, which I recommend watching. And he uses a formula in order to calculate hiring. And the purpose is to grade the applicant across 3 areas: skills, enthusiasm, and a term that he's coined, respectabilitude. It's almost the equivalent of the waiter test. That is, if you go on a date and they're a jerk to the waiter, you should leave. This isn't about how much respect does this person garner inwardly, but instead, are they the kind of person that extends respect to other people and is good at making people feel heard and seen? You'll also notice it's a pure equation. If there's a 0 anywhere along the line, the entire formula outcome is a 0. There is no such thing as a genius asshole, and someone who has the ability to make people feel heard and seen is going to be more valuable in a collaborative environment than the skilled jerk 1,000 times over. The reality is a low-skilled team member that is highly enthused and engaged is going to work far harder, be more motivated, and going to collaborate better with their peers. This person can learn quickly and upskill, but you can't necessarily make someone a better person just for the sake of a great texture. There are people out there that can give you all 3 of these, and if you can appeal to them with your projects and team, you can keep them for quite some time. But the most important part of that equation is that final number. I'm not going to go through the entire talk, but the combination of great ads and that formula will help you build an incredible team. I implore you to go and watch that talk and reframe your role in the team if you're a director, because it's fundamentally going to shift your understanding of hiring. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Practice, process, and outcomes. The reality is these things don't all happen naturally, nor do they occur just by having great leaders in place. We don't ever like everyone we work with, and when you have 10 bosses, it's inevitable you'll gel with some and not others. But the way to reduce the impact of interpersonal conflict is through clear, consistent practice, process, and outcomes. Knowing the resources available to you is a huge part of being able to adequately prepare. In games, we have a common habit of overpromising and underdelivering, often because we greatly overestimate the resources available to us, or more commonly, assume they'll stretch further than they ever could. This is where you end up with timelines that blow out, funding that doesn't cover your runway, and increased scope. As a fruit fixer, we were frequently looking at data. So we were assessed on how many appointments we took. There were leaderboards that were seen by management that could see how many we were taking, and we used a net promoter score system for feedback from customers on our performance. Data was everything and data doesn't lie, and managers had access to how many people were on the floor at any one time, we clocked in and out for every break. In order to meet our customers' needs, we had to run like clockwork. Data was used in our performance reviews, but it wasn't the only metric. Some people were great at getting great customer feedback, but only because they spent an hour at every appointment and set us behind. Data was used to inform direction, and then leadership would steer the ship. We had access to a lot of resources: case notes, people, managers, appointment systems, automated texts. There was heaps of process that supported the system working the way it was supposed to. But the problem with leaning too heavily on one resource is that then all of the others suffer. When it comes to games, the same is true. If you just throw money at a project without creating the right team, you end up with a bunch of assets that don't really gel together. If you can't afford to pay people what they can get elsewhere, you have to be able to compensate with the people and time benefits that you can give them instead. People need to know what's available to them, and you should know what's available to you. Where are your team's skill gaps? Could they be filled by upskilling, and can you do that in-house? How does this change your team structure? There are 3 key resource areas: money, people, and time. And the fruit shop had lots of money, lots of people, but hardly any time. So it was about making the most of that and building processes to minimize waiting and improve outcomes. You want to make it clear to your people what your limitations are in these spaces as soon as possible. When you're faced with a challenge, you need to look at these 3 elements and ask yourself how they can be solved. If you have a delivery problem, can you shift time? Can you shift money? Do you need more people? I tell everyone estimating for a project at a minimum of 2 weeks to major deliverables and a minimum of a month of padding wherever possible. When you're up against a short amount of money, you might think, oh, we can't afford to do that. But the reality is you can if you cut your scope and deliver less. The attempt to deliver the same amount with less resources sets you up to fail and be scrambling to get more money, more people, or more time. You need to know where you have buffer room from day one and where it sits and redirect early. You can't assume that everyone will be able to agree on priorities against these things, so you need to be able to discuss them. You need to anticipate disagreement. One of our roles at the fruit shop was to mark down the clothing that people were wearing when we made them wait on the sides of the room for us, so that people looking for them for appointments could find them really easily and address them by their name. This is great until you realise that Stacey is colourblind and Jeremy thinks a purple shirt is blue. Because of that, you have to be ready to clarify early. Make sure the team knows where you're unable to budge so they can be thinking of other solutions. This is only relevant to the information they need to do their job. We knew days when we were down staff and what this meant for us, but we were always given back time on the other side wherever possible. And we're talking about 15 minutes to half an hour, not hours. Your team doesn't have the control over resources that you do, so you need to know what you do with it. You should also be trying to clarify ownership early. Make sure your team knows what their chain of resource support is. Let your lead developer make key decisions wherever possible, and ensure your team knows who to go to with a resource problem or a question so that the solutions can either be funneled through you or the individual in question. Don't leave your team facing resource problems with no capacity to fix it and no clue on who to bring it to and being too worried to bring it to you because you're the director. We had a rule that if we got into an appointment that we knew would become what was called an escalation, taking like 40 minutes instead of 15, we were encouraged to bring it straight to leadership, whoever was on the floor, so that we could continue on with other appointments. I once handed someone off immediately after introducing myself. I was like, hi, I'm Meredith. And then they were like, I'm so furious. And I was like, can you give me 1 second? And I took 10 more appointments before I went to lunch. And when I went, my lead was still with that person. By placing someone with more freedom and more resource into the problem, I was able to extricate myself and continue my own output. I was only able to do this because I knew who I could go to, I was encouraged to use that resource, and I had that ownership knowledge. You need to assume that 80% of the work is going to be done by 20% of the resources and work as best as you can to protect those. Build a life buffer in. Your team is going to have life happen to them. Births, deaths, marriages, sure, but also mental health, a pandemic, caregiving, climate change, existential anxiety. You can control the project and the resources you have access to, but you can't control life. So build buffer early and build small. Create hiring triggers before you just go running out and hiring 11 people, straining your money and your time with a huge amount of management. What needs to be in place before that person can execute? What resources do they need access to in order to succeed? These things are in your power and will give you breathing room when life inevitably happens, which will allow you to best support your most important resource, your people. How does this factor into overpromise and underdeliver? If you've told someone you're going to get a brand new fruit and then someone says that they're going to repair your fruit instead, you're going to be disappointed. But if you flip it and you get told you're going to get a brand new fruit instead of a repair, you'll be thrilled. We see leaders overpromise and underdeliver in a few different places. We promise our team we can execute on certain timelines and then we make them crunch. We promise our team we'll get a publisher deal and then we struggle to get funding or fail to secure it. We promise our audience we'll think about adding specific features and they hear, we certainly will. We promise our publisher we can do it for less and then we struggle with our lack of resources. All of these things lead to a lack of trust. Your stakeholders are trusting you to make the necessary decisions to succeed that are reasonable. When you promise something and fail to deliver, that level of trust is eroded bit by bit. If you promise your team members a monthly one-on-one and then reschedule it every time it rolls around, that trust erodes. If you flip the script and instead plan everything with the hope to underpromise and overdeliver, it creates a different mindset. You're setting lower stakes, clearer boundaries, longer timelines. You deliver earlier, surprising your publisher. You surprise your audience with features they didn't think they'd see because you haven't promised them. This doesn't necessarily affect trust, but it affects the sense of capability your team is viewed with and improves your goodwill. So what you really want to do is underpromise and overdeliver and surprise and delight where you can. Plan for the smaller scope from the outset and set the smaller expectations. Stop overcommitting your resources and saying you'll figure it out. You absolutely will come up against challenges to figure out, but the more you reduce down on each of these areas, the better. This isn't to say you won't be in a position where you say okay to a deal that's tough because you need the money, but it means you will have already been pitching something slightly smaller than you initially needed to aim for. It's about deciding where you can compromise and how, and then surprising and delighting those areas you have compromised less on. When I worked at the fruit shop, one of the key roles was to manage the appointment queue. This meant people who had booked in advance and those who were trying to get in on a whim, and those who wandered in 5 minutes before we were closing, demanding to be seen. Every single person that came in had a different relationship to our process. I remember once vividly having to deny an appointment to a woman in this bright purple blazer, and when I told her that we didn't have anyone who I was going to keep back after an 8-hour day, because again, our people were our most important resource, to take her appointment on the spot because she hadn't come in that day, she advised me that I had just cost the fruit shop 10,000 units, which was great. I said, okay, and she left. The only reason that I was able to do this confidently was because of the safety generated by managers above me who I knew would back that decision. The training around of what our systems couldn't handle, and the reality of ensuring clarity of our process and fairness for everyone else in the same position as her. Process is necessary. It's the rudder for a ship, and people need to suck it up. If you're in production or management, you know that you have people above and below you who are uninterested in process. When we talk about process, there are 3 key definition areas you want to set up for as a leader that will lead to better outcomes across your team. 1, the process of a motivated team. 2, your business's expectations, plans and management. And then your project management, execution and tracking. In game dev, when we talk about process, we usually only talk about number 3, but managing 1 and 2 is the only way to get to a functional 3. We've talked a little about 2 earlier in values planning and a little about hiring for number 1. We've talked about showing what benefits there are, but we also need to have a deeper understanding of what hiring is. One of the challenges that people talk about with process is motivating people to engage with the structures. The way the fruit shop managed this was by having those processes to hiring. A lot of the time, the problem is you're trying to motivate people by things they're not personally motivated by. We all believe that financials are the biggest motivator, but multiple studies around it prove it to be incorrect. Dan Pink did a great TED talk called The Puzzle of Motivation, and he outlines that for centuries businesses have operated on a carrot-stick model. That is, perform well, be rewarded, underperform, be punished. This works really well when problems have super clear solutions, like with a clear set of rules and a clear single solution. We're working in game development. So whether you're in game dev or a fruit shop, there's rarely a clear single solution. You have a framework for the rules, but you're motivated by creativity and critical thinking to find the best solution in that moment. And that means a lot of crystal balling and hiring people that have the same kind of thinking framework you need for the kind of work you need them to do. This sounds obvious, but it means that 90% of motivators for people are not about the financial benefits they get, but about the individual intrinsic motivators for those people. If you consider your team members as if they were a target audience for a moment, every one of them is going to have a different motivator. One might prioritize work-life balance, so talking about how you provide dinner, not the great benefit you think it is. Another might want to drive deep into a specific area of tech you're exploring. What you really need to be doing is understanding what the internal motivation of your team members might be and the ways you have power and ability to shift your processes in order to support them. The fruit shop was great at this. It hired motivated people rather than figuring out ways of motivating people. And rather than assuming everyone was motivated by the same goals, it structured the hiring to places in teams that made sense and the operations of those teams to different expectations, measurements, and outcomes. There was clear process for each individual space. When you're hiring, this means you need to focus on 3 things that drive motivation. Autonomy. For this individual team member, what can you give them ownership of? What makes them feel as though they have the ability to make decisions or in projects and be creative within the frameworks you have? This is going to vary from team to team, project to project, but the more that you give them structured freedom to explore design, the better they'll work for you. The appointments that we took in those moments were ours to own and make decisions with. If we wanted to surprise and delight someone with a device, we could have that conversation with management and know that they would listen and recognize their autonomy. And almost never they would say no to you. Studies show that the more autonomy you give individuals and teams, the less punishing your structures are. By giving this to the right people, you'll find an uptick in productivity because they're not motivated by ticking boxes. They're motivated by these autonomous outcomes they can control. It allows them to feel like they're contributing personally to the broader goals of the business and team that they genuinely care about. The other thing is mastery. People like to be good at things. We've all seen the memes where it's like, I am not immediately good at this and therefore I quit. A lot of mastery is in the inherent desire to have valuable knowledge within a team and an industry. And if you're someone driven by mastery, you might find you simply want to be better at X, whatever that is. A generalization might assume this is particularly common in artists and programmers, but we've all seen producers who want to wrangle Jira into some kind of winged magical beast and create burn-down charts in the sky like Doctor Strange style. For team members at the fruit shop, being able to immediately diagnose a problem was extremely motivating, especially when the response was shock and delight from the person it had been frustrating. For others, it was about being able to consistently get super high positive feedback. It was about what mastery was important to that individual and how the structures of the business supported us in those important structures. Purpose. This is one of the big ones, and one I see games fail at far more often than other industries. We've already talked about most studios not having a business plan or a sense of the values. The purpose of a business, obviously, is often to make money. They might want your business to succeed, sure, but we don't often take jobs because we want to help the organisation make more money. The motivator comes from the sense of being part of something, but no one can feel part of something if the broader something doesn't know what it wants to be. Sit down when you're hiring and think about the kind of autonomy you can give them, the kind of mastery you can provide them, and the purpose you're working towards. Not everyone is going to have need for all three. Some people might just want to come to work and complete their job, and mastery might not even be on the cards. Some might want to be directly assigned tasks, tick them off and proceed on. Autonomy might not be interesting to them. Keep this in mind and try and sense the people whose desires align directly with what you need of that role. From there, you can figure out what motivates people to engage with process. Some team members love visibility and others can't stand it. Ask yourself, do you need them to engage with task tracking, or is daily stand-up enough? What level of information do they need to pass on in order for people to do their job? Have a conversation with them to explain what level of visibility you need from them and what your expectations are, and ask them what they feel is a time sink. Assume positive intent when it comes to people. People don't want to be difficult, but it's hard to engage with something you don't care about, especially if you don't understand the impact of it. You need to explain the value of their impact. Do you need them in every meeting? If you keep pulling people uninterested in process into engaging with it against their will, they're not going to want to do it autonomously. By understanding the core motivations of your team members, you can either set up a task tracking system that works for them, or as a producer, work with them to get them excited about their work and sharing where their progress is. One system that we used to do was going around in a sprint review and talking about something we worked on that we were proud of that week. For the programmers, this meant they got a chance to talk about the impact of their code. So often in task tracking, we talk about outcome but not impact. This is great for artists who can show a visible outcome, but for programmers who are motivated by the impact they have, it means nothing. By giving them a chance to talk about it, it brought more clarity to the tracking of the project in general and made them more engaged with marking their tasks off. Understand their motivations and do your best to build systems to support them. Which brings us to our final section, people. So how do we hear people better? A lot of my role at the fruit shop daily was taking those appointments that I mentioned, and you had about 15 minutes max to solve their problem. But often the problem was solvable in like an instant. However, if you fixed it too quickly for certain people, this made them madder than when they walked in. So you ended up learning very quickly to figure out what someone was actually after, and it usually split into a few categories. One was an immediate solution to unblock the thing that was a problem to them. This sometimes came with emotion, but often not. Sometimes it was assistants, friends, not even their device. And this is often what you'll see in terms of just tasks where there's a block in the way. They just want to get on with it. They're not too bothered by it. They're not hurt by it. Other people really wanted to be heard and validated. For a lot of them, the inconvenience they'd experienced made them frustrated. They relied on this to feel engaged, competent. It was so much more than the fruit. And to immediately resolve the problem doesn't acknowledge the benefits of their frustration. They wanted to know that you understood that they had had a poor experience. These are my favorites because you could turn them around really, really easily and really make someone's day and have them walk out of there completely different to how they came in. Then there was the real challenge. You were the reason their fruit had failed. You had personally come to their house in the night, stole away, and squished their battery life, wringing the neck of the orange until it squealed. These ones were my second favorites because they were really hard to turn around, but it was possible. We had a great tool that I've since gone on to use in all my relationships, friendships, work environments, basically everything, every interaction ever. We've all heard talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is an isolating toxin that you can engage with because it invalidates the experience of the other person, but you get to feel really good about yourself. But if you can't seem to relate, it's going to set you up as adversaries. You're experiencing something from the other side of the fence. So we used a technique called acknowledge, align, and assure. You might go, well, of course you're going to acknowledge the problem. It's nothing to do with acknowledging the problem. What you're actually doing is acknowledging the root feeling the problem has caused, listening beyond the issue itself to hear the emotion connected to it. You then want to align with their experience. Find a time you've been in a similar situation or felt a similar emotion. You don't have to have experienced it. You won't always have something you can use here. And that's when you need to be honest about that fact. It's far worse to pretend you have an understanding of someone's worst day if you don't. Finally, assure. Assure them you're not only going to do your best to solve the problem, but to hear them and support them through it. So what does this look like in practice in games? A team member comes up to me and they say, this other team member's textures aren't wrapping correctly to models and it's causing a whole host of issues. And I could say, no worries, I'll look into it and leave it at that. But often what they're actually saying to me isn't these textures are a problem. What they're saying is I'm frustrated because the quality of my work, or the quality of work being provided to me is impeding on my ability to deliver on my work. And I'm worried this will affect my outcomes. I want to protect myself from this and express that frustration. So instead, I acknowledge the feelings and problem, align with the frustration, and explain how I'll resolve it. There's an outcome that they can understand, and acknowledgement of their feelings. Both are the same, but the second one shows I trust them, I hear them, and the problem is now mine, and I will do my best to resolve it. So now we get to one of the most important sections of the entire talk. Psychological safety is a slightly newer term that you'll hear thrown around. It's coined by Amy Edmondson, professor of leadership at Harvard Business School. It's about creating a climate in which people can hear from you. It's about you as a leader weeding out the problems and your team trusting you enough to bring them up. You might hear psychological safety and think this means being nice. Nope. It's about being direct and as a leader showing the same level of vulnerability and curiosity you want your team to. Amy did a whole bunch of research, my friend Amy, about whether or not better teams made fewer mistakes and found it was often the opposite. Teams that perform better tended to make more mistakes, which begs the question, do they actually make more mistakes or are they simply more able to recognize them and talk about them? People in general tend to weight their decisions very differently. There's a great book that I'd recommend you read called Sway that talks about the pull of irrational behaviour, why even when we know better, we sometimes make choices against our better judgment that we know could cause huge problems down the track. Say, for example, you're an associate producer in a team-wide meeting and you notice there's something totally missing from the timeline. You worry that you've misinterpreted the plan entirely. In that moment, the sense of potential humiliation if you speak up looms a lot larger than the potential problem that comes later when the work is missed. Even though the work being missed is the bigger problem, it seems fuzzier and further away and therefore way less dangerous. In order for a team to succeed, they need to have three things in place: high standards, high ambition, and psychological safety. In order to be a psychologically safe leader, you need to model the kind of fact-finding you want to see. Problem solving is a team sport, so you need to ask questions and express curiosity and put yourself in positions where as often as possible, you might be incorrect, wherever you need to be, in order to weed out the issues in your team. If we think about the idea of the rockstar, auteur, or dream organisations, they can be very good at 1 and 2, talking about how high their ambition is and how high their standards are. But many directors think that fear works, or that simply from their time and experience only they know better. This is what they want or else, and this can work for a while. But what fear does over time is it motivates hiding of the key issues. Others think they're doing a great job of psychological safety, but in fact, they undermine it frequently. People can't meet your high standards if you don't believe they can meet you there. If you hired someone, you did so because you believed they had what it takes to succeed in your team. In the past, when work had clear outcomes, it was easy to look at a team member and know if they were performing. But when so much of the work we do is creative, there's so many details that depend on each other and the work is uncertain, as well as the outcomes. So we need to reset the way in which we empower creative people to do creative work. Some of the ways that psychological safety is undermined include asking for feedback and telling everyone how much you want to hear the issues, and then doing 70% of the talking. Not only does this teach everyone that you don't actually want to hear what they have to say, it shows you're totally unaware of the impact of your leadership. You're crowding the conversation. Another is undermining value. People are hired to do a job, so why congratulate them on doing their job? That's what they're supposed to do. Similarly, they might look at their role as a leader to point out the ways in which you're not bringing value that's defined by them. At the fruit shop, we were frequently recognised and celebrated for the small successes, which made it easier to talk about the missed opportunities. There was balance. It wasn't all failings being discussed all the time. We've all had a micromanaging leader, but ask yourself, truly, are you one? You might not be staring over people's shoulders, but if you struggle to delegate, can't step away from tasks, need final approval on everything involved in the game, you are probably micromanaging far more than you'd like to admit. And I've been guilty of this too. If you've struggled with managing your team as they've gone remote because you don't know if there are bums on seats, again, you might have a problem. You hired people to do a job, so how do you give them the autonomy they deserve? Why hire people that you don't then trust to take control of their work? Finally, ruling with fear and distance. If you yell at your team, tell them in groups what they're doing isn't good enough, you're doing something pretty obviously wrong, and you're probably not in this audience. If, however, you've uttered the phrase, I don't really need them to like me, I need them to succeed, you do have a problem. By removing the humanity from your team and yourself and distancing it as a them, you're setting yourself up for a culture of feeling unsafe. It's not about liking you, it's about feeling safe to bring you things. So how can you easily succeed in creating psychological safety? There are 3 steps. And similar to feedback, you want to frame the work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. Acknowledge the work we're doing is fuzzy and sometimes ambiguous, and the only way we can find the outcomes we need is digging up all the bad along with the good together and learning as a team. This is similar to that feedback approach, but it breeds a culture of sharing and mistake exploration rather than condemnation. You need to acknowledge your own fallibility and own it. You can't be everywhere, and nor should you be. It's about creating a relationship of trust that you know that you want to help and support and encourage, and that they know that too. Take the actions necessary to make those things visible, and then take action when things are brought to you. Be proactive in seeking out and solving problems where you have the power to do so. Model curiosity, ask lots of questions, be honest about what you're not clear on so that other people can too. So we all have trauma, right? Woo! Let's talk about it. Recent studies show that burnout takes 3 to 5 years to recover from. If you're in a broken environment, whether as a leader or staff member, you cannot recover and work in a psychologically safe way. It's slowly going to erode your ability to deliver because you're not going to believe you can deliver it all. So you're not going to speak up, you're not going to be autonomous, you're not going to master anything, and you are going to become more and more unmotivated. The saying, we don't leave jobs, we leave bosses, is very true. If you're managing up all the time, this erosion is going to occur. You need to leave as soon as possible. This isn't an easy thing, but like a poor relationship, it's easy to fall into the trap of this is just how it is, or that you can solve the problems if you just love it enough. All the tools in this talk only work when the person with ownership of the company takes ownership of this active studio work. Similarly, as a leader, you often can't talk about how you really feel. There's obviously no nuance to Twitter. There's a sense of information sharing if you talk to the wrong people. Wherever possible, find people on a similar executive level to you and create areas where you can speak openly and vent in a way that will not damage your team. This means discords with frequently wiped channels with only people you trust implicitly, like less than 10 people. Zoom calls with one-on-one where you know that nothing leaves that room. Unrecorded information. You need space to be human too, but you cannot take the responsibility of your humanity to your team. You can take your humanity to them, but not the responsibility. So you owe them stability, and it's your role to protect them and not bring them your problems. I didn't have much of a choice about ending my career at the fruit shop. I got vocal nodules from speaking so loudly over the hum of a store for 8 hours a day. And as much as I love my work, it was not a sustainable environment for me and my voice. The support that I got from all members of staff when life happened on both a personal and professional level was unparalleled. I knew I was valued as a person beyond what I could bring as a resource because I stopped producing. This is where I always recommend having multiple founders. Give yourself room to disagree, where you all have the same level of power and control so you can challenge one another and trust one another. And then find your external supports. Create a scaffolding so that you can be a human and not just a producer of a resource. Also, have friends who aren't in games who can look at you and go, this makes no sense and is weird and that shouldn't be a big deal. And you can go, yeah, you are actually completely correct. That's true. Recognize where your impact ends. I didn't go into detail about all the conflict at Fruit Shop, but there was a lot on lots of levels. We have a lot that happens in our community around restorative justice and what that looks like, and there are often things that are outside our control as leaders, beyond our workplace. Often we can only directly affect the environment we're actively involved in and pressure those that we can't. Don't expect yourself to have every answer or solve every problem. One of the most common problems we saw were fluffy fruits. That is, where you would charge the fruit, but fluff and debris from the pockets of people storing them would get compacted by cables, and suddenly the fruits were broken and wouldn't charge. You might be thinking, surely it wouldn't be affected by something so little. Surely the fruit is still fine. Or people would recognize that it wasn't plugging in correctly and just quickly clear it out. There's a reason that it was the #1 appointment. There's a reason the phrase is the straw that broke the camel's back, not the giant ton of bricks that broke the camel's back. And there's a reason we can't recognize our own fallibility a lot of the time. The fruits weren't broken. They were just slammed with things, life, getting in the way of them recharging. So here comes my most important tip for you as a leader. Go to therapy. I'm not kidding. We work in an industry that is highly creative with high levels of pressure. This is an expense that will pay for itself 1,000 times over. It will give you tools and strategies to deal with your home and work life better. It will help you unpack your natural reactions and trauma responses and rewire them to be healthy, making you a happier, kinder, more thoughtful leader because you won't be knee-jerk reacting your trauma all over the place whenever you engage with your team. You cannot create psychologically safe environments if you're not dealing with the things in your very own head that prevent you from being a better leader. Doing this, being honest about it as well, and making space for it within your team, that it's something that you do and something that you encourage them to do, and the world. It's so valuable, I can't emphasize it enough. If you are sitting there thinking, I do not need to go to therapy, I am fine, I promise you, you are the target audience and you need it more than you think. A space where you can vent freely will free you from a lot of the things that you will bring to your day job. Don't bring those things to your team. Thanks! If If you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter at Mary H. Feel free to email me. Mary Hate, apparently. Mary H. I'm not Mary Hate, Mary H. I hope you enjoyed the talk and have a great GCAP and a wonderful midwife.